Welcome to everyone. We are excited to be doing this webinar today for this special edition of Creation Justice webinars as we come together to discern how to best care for creation and work together for justice, because the two go together like organic toast and strawberry jam, or soil and sunshine. What you pick the metaphor. But we are here today, especially excited to be with my co-host, Malcom, Alabama Interfaith Power and Light. We will be, today, Michael, I feel it's almost like a TV talk show, because we've got someone who is TV famous, and we also have a special guest. It's kind of like that moment when walking through the red curtains right now. We get to say that we are also joined by the Reverend Jim Antal, who will be introducing Katherine Hayhoe to us. So we are delighted to have both our special guest and our surprise guest with us today. Before we turn things over to Jim to introduce our special guest for today, Michael, can you give us some theological framing as we get started?
Absolutely. Thank you, Brooks, and thank everyone for joining us. Thank you, Katherine and Jim, Reverend Jim. We thank you as well. In fact, I'm glad that Reverend Antal is on the line with us, because I'm actually referring to his book. It inspired me today as I was driving for a breakfast meeting this morning, and I thought that it would be apropos to use it in this setting, because in his book he talked about or made reference to the watchman on the wall, and I think that is exactly what we're doing today. We're being watchmen on the wall. We're obtaining information for things that are happening outside that could do irreversible harm to us as a people, as a civilization, as a society. One of the things that he reminded me of in his book was that the national security is directly tied to climate change. And the scarcity of resources is something that we as those who love people and those who are called to be watchmen on the wall should be concerned with, because that does create for us even more damage, or the potential of even more damage, when it comes down to how do we make sure that the people's needs are met, in particular when the people's resources are dying, and how do we comfort the people when they come to the realization that it's all because of them, that they have actually killed off their resources. I read an article today or a couple of days ago that there are now over 1 million species that are threatened with extinction. That's on us. How do we as watchmen on the wall both compel people that need to hear this message and comfort those who see people still going about life as they've been doing all the time? Watchmen, what do you have to say on the wall when it comes down to declaring this message? And I think that it's great that we have Katherine Hayhoe here, because she'll provide us tools and provide us with some knowledge building, so that when we do go and we do compel people, and to compel people is to make that truth so plain that they can't run from it. To compel people is to constrain them, and not in a way that it's aggressive and abrupt where you're actually destroying life, but be aggressive and abrupt to the point that they can't get away from it. Let them know, hey, you are destroying your own self. You are destroying your own resources. You are killing out your own, you are choking your own life because of the purchases that you make. These are the things that we are compelled to tell men and women as watchmen on the wall. Thank you, Brooks, for your time, and I will talk to you all after we hear from Katherine Hayhoe.
Great honor to introduce Katherine. I'm sure people now know that Watchmen on the Wall isn't about Game of Thrones, so thank you. That is, so I'm really thrilled that we got Jim here to introduce our speaker and presenter today, because she does so much that it's almost like I just want to say, you know, just stop for a while so I can catch up with what you did last week. But I know Jim does keep up with what she does, and so Jim, I'll let you give the introductions.
So I thought about doing this on a spontaneous basis, Catherine, but I think I would probably take up the whole hour if I did that, even if I limited my comments to your Twitter feed. So I've actually prepared something here that I want to go through in a rather orderly way, and I want to begin with scripture from the book of Esther, which contains a lot of wisdom, but the line that is most frequently quoted, at least in UCC circles, is from the 4th chapter. Perhaps you were born for just such a time as this. So it's great we have this technology. I can look into your eyes, Catherine, and say that to you, because I don't think anyone better exemplifies this scripture than you. You are one of the most foremost climate scientists in the world. You serve as director of the Climate Science Center at Texas Tech University, but that's only the tip of the iceberg, and that will be my last pun. Catherine is widely regarded as the go-to person when pastors or scientists or politicians want to understand how best to communicate the realities of climate change in a way that empowers people to take action. That's the focus of the Atmos Research, a consulting enterprise, which she is founder of and also the CEO. Catherine's YouTube channel, Global Weirding, tackles all the myths and misunderstandings about climate change and climate communication in 5 to 10 minute segments. Her Twitter activity, I would say, is legendary. She's an evangelical Christian, married to an evangelical pastor, and her tenured academic position at Texas Tech is in the Department of Political Science. That's a well-kept secret, Catherine. But don't let that fool you, folks. She is the principal author of the 4th National Climate Assessment, issued last year by the White House. This report of hundreds and hundreds of pages, I couldn't figure out how many pages it had, Catherine. You can tell us maybe. All right, there it is. Was released in December, but when that date was, it was supposed to be released in December, but when that date was moved up by several weeks to the Friday after Thanksgiving, so that the media would pay no attention to the report, Catherine had to pull off several all-nighters for final proofing. That's the kind of faithful professional she is in everything she does. That, along with the fact that she's one of the most likable people you'll ever meet. Catherine, welcome. Thanks for helping us to move from climate reports to moral imperatives. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jim. And welcome to everybody on this call. There is such a huge variety of people from all around the country, and I see a few names from over the border as well. You all, as I can see from your affiliations, you're already plugged into this issue. You don't need somebody else telling you why it's important. So what I'm going to focus on today is my own very specific expertise, which Jim highlighted, which is looking at the science. And specifically, I'm going to review the 2,000 pages. That's how many pages the National Climate Assessment was. I'm going to review the 2,000 pages for you in just about 20 or 25 minutes. So you do not have to read the document. You'll get all of the highlights here. And then if you want more information, you can go to a specific chapter and dig a little bit deeper into that chapter alone. You're welcome, Jim. So let me share my screen with you because it's a lot easier if we actually look at the images together. Just a second here. Okay. So highlights from the 4th U.S. National Climate Assessment. This is more relevant today than any time. We know that no matter where we live around the country, we see destructive impacts from supersized hurricanes, from recent flooding in the U.S. Midwest, from California wildfires over the past year. I think our perspective on climate change today is best summed up by the Prime Minister of Dominica, which is one of the Caribbean islands that was devastated by a changing climate. And that is, he said, when speaking to the United Nations after the 2017 hurricane season, he said, to deny climate change is to deny a truth that we have just lived. So the National Climate Assessment is divided up into 2 volumes. The first volume is 450 pages. The second volume is over 1,600 pages. Volume 1 was actually released a year ago, last November. So not this past November, but the year before. And it's also called the Climate Science Report because it talks specifically about the science. You can find it online at science2017.globalchange.gov. And I was one of the lead authors on this report, and I specifically wrote a chapter on future scenarios, what's going to happen in the future and how our choices matter. And then I also wrote the last chapter with my colleague Bob Kopp on surprises. What are some potentially unpleasant surprises in the climate system? So this volume is all currently, even still, the most comprehensive and up-to-date assessment of the state of climate science today. Until the next comprehensive IPCC assessment report comes out, which is not for a couple more years, this is the most up-to-date summary of the state of climate science. So if you want to know what's going on with the science, this is the best resource to go to. But if I had to summarize the more than 400 pages in just one sentence, this is the sentence I would use. It's real, it's us, it's serious, and the window of time to prevent widespread dangerous impacts is closing fast. That is basically what Volume 1 tells us. In my chapter, I looked at the future, and what we found is that beyond the next few decades, the change we see over the next few decades is primarily a result of what we've already done. But beyond the next few decades, what we're going to see depends primarily on what? On our choices. This is a really important result because it both cautions us as well as giving us motivation and hope to act. Because if we felt like all of climate change was baked in and there was really nothing we could do to fix it, if it's too late, why act? Why not just eat, drink, and be merry for tomorrow we die? Realizing the power of human agency, the fact that the difference between these shaded areas on the right-hand side, which show different amounts of temperature change, the difference between these shaded areas is primarily due to the difference between the different colored lines on the left, and these different colored lines on the left represent different futures that we choose. Specifically, what will our emissions of carbon dioxide and other heat-trapping gases look like? And this in turn depends on how are we going to get our energy, from where, are we going to get more efficient with the way we use it, and how are we going to manage our lands and our agriculture? These are the choices that we face today, and our choices will have a tremendous impact on the future. The amount of climate change that's baked in is about this much. The amount that we can actually affect is about this much. That's what this tells us. It also offers, though, a very cautionary note, and this is from the last chapter, which I also co-wrote. When we look back in time at the way things have been before, one of the most frequent arguments that I get probably every day now on Twitter almost is, it's been warmer before, and it's been colder before. There's natural cycles. Why are you so worried about a changing climate today? And the answer to that is because, yes, the planet has been warmer and colder before, but we didn't have pushing 8 billion people on the planet at that time. The last time CO2 levels were this high, when we wrote this report a year and a half ago, it was 3 million years ago. We now know that number is quite a bit larger. It's actually 15 million years ago. There weren't humans running around building cities and developing agriculture and having buildings and infrastructure and energy and economic systems back 15 million years ago. The reason why we care is it's not about saving the planet, this hunk of rock. It will endure. It's about saving ourselves and every living thing that inhabits this planet. That is what is at risk. Because what the historical climate record also tells us is that in the past, when there's been very large changes, these have been accompanied by widespread extinctions. And today we are already facing tremendous biodiversity loss. The United Nations report was just released yesterday, talking about how human life itself and our expansion across the planet, leaving climate change out of the picture, alone endangers millions of species. But when you add climate change on top, it makes it even worse. So if our carbon emissions continue to grow over this century and beyond, it would lead to levels that we haven't seen in tens of millions of years. And if we look back as far as we can in time, even the last time we've seen when climate changed the fastest from natural causes, only a fraction, about 10% of the carbon we produce every year was being pushed from the ocean into the atmosphere naturally to cause that change. So we are truly conducting an unprecedented experiment with our planet, the only home that we have. So people often say, well, when we look at public opinion data, and this is from the Yale program on climate communication. It's a great program. These maps are fantastic. You can zoom in on your congressional district or on your county. And right here, I've highlighted the county I live in at the bottom, Lubbock County. When we look at public opinion across the US, we say estimated percentage of adults who think global warming is real and caused by humans. Anything that is yellow or orange is more than 50% of people. Anything that is blue is less than 50%. And so we look at these wide swaths of blue across the country and we think to ourselves, as I say in one of our global weirding episodes online, we think if they just knew the facts, surely they'd change their minds, right? Now, in terms of our global weirding episodes, we actually have over 30 of them now. We have one for every part of the country, talking about how climate change affects you in that part of the country. We also have one for Canada as well. But our two most popular episodes are the ones I would not have guessed. This one is number 2, and our most popular episode is What Does the Bible Say About Climate Change? That's the one that the most people have watched. And again, this is a PBS show. It's not a Christian show or a religious show. We also have one that's a little bit more ecumenical that talks about how does religion have anything to do with climate change. So there's a second one that pairs with What Does the Bible Say About Climate Change that I would encourage you to check out if you're interested. But in this case, the answer to this question, I'll give you a preview, is no. And so when the New York Times wrote up the first volume of the National Climate Assessment a year ago last November, they asked me, is it going to change minds? And I said, I don't think so. If somebody's not already on board with the climate science, or they're just kind of disengaged and they feel like it doesn't matter, more information about Arctic sea ice or ocean acidification or how the jet stream is changing is not going to change their minds. And in fact, Dan Kahan at Yale had already looked into this a number of years before. He found that people with the highest degree of scientific literacy were not most concerned about climate change, they were most polarized. In subsequent research, he went on to find that essentially, paraphrasing, the smarter we are, the better we are at just cherry picking the pieces of data that support our pre-existing opinions. So being smart is not necessarily an advantage here. And that shows that people don't really have a problem with the actual science, because the science we use to understand our planet is so fundamental and so basic. It's the same science that we use to explain how stoves heat food or how airplanes fly. And there's a website for everything these days and a YouTube video too, but there's not a lot of them talking about how stoves don't really heat food or airplanes don't really fly. It's just a giant conspiracy with planes on wires or CGI. There probably is one or two, but it's not very widespread. So that shows that it isn't really the science people have a problem with. And in fact, if you look at the polling data, we see something very interesting. So this is the same figure I showed you before that says, do you agree with the science? So here's 450 pages from the National Climate Assessment. Do you agree with it? And essentially, the orange areas would say yes and the blue areas would say no. But when you ask people, is global warming happening? Look at this. It is dark orange across the whole country with the exception of one county in Utah, one in West Virginia, and one in Georgia, just right at the border. That's it. And then, this is kind of crazy, they say, do you think global warming will affect plants and animals? Well, even if people don't think it's happening, they think it's going to affect plants and animals, because every county is orange now. So everybody pretty much says, sure, global warming is happening, and it's going to affect plants and animals. Is it going to affect future generations? Yeah, everybody says, yeah. I think it will affect future generations. Will it affect people in developing countries? It's a little bit lighter here. You start to see some blue come in, but it's still a lot darker than do you agree with the science, right? Do you think global warming will affect people, specifically you? No. This is the problem. Look how dark blue this map is. Yes. I know. I love your reaction. We don't think it's going to affect us. Now, let me take just a little divergence here. In other talks where I talk more about, from a faith-based perspective, why would we care? I show how when you ask people, do you care about climate change? And you break people down by denomination and by affiliation, but then you also break them down by race, we see that the most concerned people group in the whole United States about a changing climate, more than anybody else and a lot higher than average, and this survey was done before the Pope's encyclical came out, the most concerned people group are Hispanic Catholics. And that explains a lot of the counties you see in New Mexico, Western Texas, and California. Interestingly, the ones up in South Dakota, those might be due to the pipeline issues there. A lot of people are very aware and motivated because of the pipeline protests. But so then people might say, well, of course, I mean, the Pope cares so much about climate change. Of course, Hispanic Catholics are at the top. Well, you know who's at the bottom? You might think it's white evangelicals. I'm happy to say no. They got inched out by 1 percentage point by white Catholics. White Catholics care least. Yes. And so one of my colleagues, Ashley Landrum, here at Texas Tech, is in media and communication, and she actually studies public opinion and what influences it. So after the encyclical came out, she studied what impact it had on people's opinions. And what she found is this: if Christians, and this held true, I think, for Protestants as well as Catholics, if Christians already agreed that climate change was real, then the Pope's encyclical increased their opinion of the Pope. They thought better of the Pope, and their awareness also increased. But if they didn't agree with the Pope on climate change, when the encyclical was released, it didn't change their opinion about climate change, it changed their opinion of the Pope. As they would say here in Texas, their reaction was kind of like, oh, bless his heart, which means he means well, but he has no clue what he's talking about. Anyway, that's a little divergence there to just talk about those orange counties. But what we're really focusing on here is the blue counties. The fact that even in California and New York, and what you would see as kind of hotbeds of people who are very concerned about climate change, even, you know, the West Coast, Oregon, Seattle, Portland, it's blue. Why is it blue? One of the biggest reasons it's blue is because when you talk about global warming, the #1 image that comes to people's minds, an animal that hardly anybody has seen in real life. And if this is the reason why climate change matters, really, this has nothing to do with us. Or if we do see pictures of people, typically those pictures have been, as this photograph taken by Gary Brosh, who was really a pioneering photographer. Decades ago, he traveled around the world taking pictures of people affected by climate change before he passed away very suddenly in an accident. These pictures are from people who live far away on islands in the South Pacific with names like Tuvalu and Kiribati that we're not even sure that we can pronounce correctly. And so we think, well, but this just doesn't matter to us. And so that's why I truly believe that despite all the headlines we see, despite all the science denial that is rampant in politics today, not just in the US, but in Canada, even in the UK and England and beyond, despite all of the science denial, I believe that the most dangerous and most widespread myth that the largest number of us have bought into is not the myth that the science is somehow not real or optional or fake. It's the myth that it doesn't matter to me. That is the most dangerous myth, because if it doesn't matter to me, why would we act? So that is where volume 2 of the National Climate Assessment comes in. Volume 2 directly tackles that myth. You can find it online at nca2018.globalchange.gov. And it's organized very nicely by chapter, so you don't have to read the whole thing. You can go to whatever chapter you want. They have a chapter for each region, and they have a chapter for each sector. So what is a sector? Water, health, infrastructure, ecosystems, transportation, energy, things like that. What does volume 2 tell us? Well, volume 2 is the most comprehensive and up-to-date assessment, not of the science, but of how it's affecting us and how we are responding. It was written by over 350 authors, including me, and If I had to summarize it, because it's over 1,600 pages, I'm going to take 3 sentences instead of just one. These are my 3 sentences. Climate change isn't a distant issue anymore. The assessment is loaded with examples of what's happening today. It's affecting every single one of us in every part of the US across almost every sector. And this is really important. The more climate changes, the more serious and even dangerous the impacts will become. Like what? Well, it talks about how high tide flooding in many small towns along the Northeast coast has already increased by a factor of 10 since the 1960s. This is not storm-related flooding. This is just sea level rise plus high tide, what they call sunny day or nuisance flooding. We already have climate refugees within the borders of the United States. People who are having to leave their home, in this case their ancestral home, because sea level is rising and the land on which their town is built is sinking, which in Louisiana is primarily due to the extraction of oil and gas and water from underground reservoirs and aquifers. So it's a 1-2 punch. We're going to take the stuff out and then we're going to burn it. And when you put those both together, it gives you double the sea level rise. We know that California is characterized by wildfires. Wildfires are a natural part of the ecosystem in California. Without a changing climate since the 1980s, California would have seen about 11 million acres burned by wildfire naturally. But what is climate change doing? It is loading the weather dice against us. It is increasing the risk of really bad wildfires burning greater area. So with a changing climate, instead, wildfires have burned almost 24 million acres, which is more than double. And you can see this only goes up to 2015. If you added the next 3 years, going through the end of 2018 with the Camp Fire and the Thomas Fire and all the other record-breaking fires, you would see this orange go off the charts. We know that what used to be permanently frozen ground up in the Arctic is crumbling and thawing, putting over 200 Native American villages at imminent risk. There's also climate refugees up there. We also know that on the islands in the Pacific and the Atlantic, they are at enormous amount of risk because as sea level rises, there's nowhere to go. So important infrastructure like airports, important historical sites with these carved statues in Hawaii, temples, grave sites, are typically located right beside the ocean, and they're in danger of being flooded. Even here in Texas, we already get more naturally occurring weather and climate extremes than any other state in the country, and I'll show you the evidence there just a sec. But even in Texas, our extremes are getting more extreme, whether it's stronger droughts, supercharged hurricanes, or more extreme heat days. If we look around the whole US since 1980, there have been 102 events that have caused at least $1 billion worth of damage. And this is not just the event, but it's actually having the damage too. So if Hurricane Harvey had not come ashore, it wouldn't be on this map. It's on this map because it caused $125 billion worth of damage to Texas. So we know that we're already at risk from naturally occurring weather and climate disasters like heat waves, heavy rain events, floods, droughts, hurricanes, wildfires, and more. But climate change is taking our natural weather dice and loading them against us. Decade by decade, as climate warms, as more energy builds up in the climate system, it's sneaking in and taking one of these numbers and replacing it with another 6, and another 6, and then a 7. And all of a sudden, we're rolling a double 7. Like Hurricane Harvey, like the Midwest floods, like the floods that we're experiencing in my home province of Ontario the last 2 weeks, like the wildfires in California, we're rolling double 7s. We say, where did these 7s come from on the dice? The answer is climate change. Climate change didn't create the dice already existed. It is loading those dice against us. The reason why we care about a changing climate is because it exacerbates the risks that we already face today. And there was a third report that you probably never heard about that came out the same day as Volume 2 on Black Friday, so right after Thanksgiving this past year. The second report, and I'm just going to tell you one highlight from this report, It's called The State of the Carbon Cycle. You can find it online at carbon2018.globalchange.gov. And what it did was it connected the dots between volume 2, which talks about the impacts, and this report talks about how much it would cost to fix it. So here's just a little tidbit to whet your appetite for this third report. It found that for the United States, the cost of reducing our carbon emissions to be consistent with the Paris targets of keeping warming below 2 degrees and 1.5 if we can. Of course, that's in Celsius. So about 3.5 degrees, keeping it below 3.5 degrees if we can. And what's 1.5, like 2.8 if possible, Fahrenheit. So the cost of reducing emissions consistent with the Paris target would be $1 to $4 trillion for the United States, not including co-benefits. What are co-benefits? The fact that burning coal and gas and oil is responsible for 200,000 deaths per year in the United States alone from air pollution. That's a pretty big co-benefit. And in fact, if you follow me on Facebook, let me actually just show you this right now because my post today on Facebook talks specifically about the co-benefits. If you follow me on Facebook, and I will show you what that looks like here, just a second. This is what my account looks like. So if you see, whoops, if you see something like this, this is my account. And the post that I posted today talks about how global fossil fuel subsidies, about 1/3 of fossil fuels wouldn't even make it today without subsidies. They're subsidized to the tune of over $160,000 US per second around the world. If we had removed these subsidies, carbon emissions since 2015, so 4 years, not even 4 years. Since 2015, carbon emissions would have fallen 28%. We would have reduced 4.5 million deaths from fossil fuel related air pollution around the world. And government revenue would have increased by 3.8% of the GDP. Yeah, the economics are there. So let me just go into it. So co-benefits are things like that, reducing air pollution. Today, the US GDP, this is just US numbers alone, the US GDP is nearly 20 trillion per year. So the cost of meeting the Paris Agreement would be between 5 to 20% of 1 year's worth of GDP, 1 year. If you spread it out over 20 years, it would be anywhere from 1/4 to 1% per year. Okay, so now let's put that together with this National Climate Assessment. The cost of not reducing emissions and continuing on our current path is estimated to cost $200 billion per year. So that's 1/5 of our GDP per year by 2050. So what that means is it would take us between 5 to 20 years if we met the Paris Agreement to experience the financial benefits. Now, we in the US are expected to lose about 1% of our GDP per year, but the world's poorest countries are expected to lose 20 to 25% of their GDP per year. So by any objective economic analysis that considers the costs and the benefits over a maximum of 20 years or longer, the Paris Agreement makes sense, and it probably is actually only 10, but we scientists prefer to be conservative. It's just economics. But when we look around the world, there's more to it than economics. This is a map showing where people currently live in poverty today. The darker the color, the greater the percentage of the population lives in poverty. Keep this geographic pattern in your mind. This is a map of who's most vulnerable to a changing climate. Pretty much the exact same, right? Because they're poor, because they lack access to the resources we have, because they don't have alternatives when disaster strikes. The reason why I care so much about a changing climate is not because of the economic impacts on the US as a whole, as a country. It's because climate change exacerbates humanitarian crises like hunger, lack of access to clean water, which already kills millions of people per year, most of them under the age of 5. People dying from diseases in 2019 that nobody should be dying from in this day and age. The best description that I've ever heard of climate change comes from the US military. They call it a threat multiplier. The image that I use in my head is an image of a bucket. We are pouring everything we can into this bucket to help people who are suffering today. We put in our money, we put in our time, we put in our prayers, we put in everything we can to help fix people who don't have enough, not fix people, but fix people's situations who don't have enough to eat. who don't have access to clean water, who don't have a safe place for their family to live. But climate change is the hole in the bucket. And if we don't fix that hole, we're not going to be able to fix any of the other problems. And that's why climate change matters. So that's why to care about a changing climate, all we have to be is ourselves. As they say in Texas, where they published the version of the Bible on roadsides, that love thy neighbor thing, I meant it, signed God. Why do we care about a changing climate? I want to close with 3 reasons. First, we care because it takes the risks we already face in the places where we live today, and it exacerbates them or amplifies them. And this is what the National Climate Assessment talks about in detail. But second, we care about it because it profoundly affects real people today, especially the poorest and vulnerable in our own communities right here in North America, as well as around the world, the very people who have done the least to contribute to the problem. And so climate change is a profoundly unjust issue. In fact, a recent study that just came out showed that climate change is making the very richest people in the world currently richer, and it is making all of the poorest people in the world poorer. It is the largest injustice of our generation. But then the third reason why we care is because we believe that God has given us responsibility for the welfare of every living thing. And this comes right out of Genesis 1. So I want to leave you with this thought. Whoever we are, whatever we care about, wherever we live, we are already the perfect person to care about a changing climate. Because to care about a changing climate, we just have to be a human who lives on this earth, who cares for and has a heart and has compassion for all the others who share it with us. Thank you.
Brooks, I think you're on mute. Brooks, you're on mute. We can't hear you.
Oh, there we go. Thought I unmuted myself. Great, great. Thank you so much. Many of us are applauding silently or mutedly. Thank you for that terrific presentation. I want to encourage people now to ask questions by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of their screen. You can type in your question for Katherine there, and we can all take a look at it, and she can respond to it. As we wait for people to type in their questions there, Michael or Jim, would you like to get the conversation started with questions of your own?
Sure, I'll jump in. Katherine, I want to preface what I have to say by saying I have no desire to put you on the spot at all. Do you have anything to say about the Green New Deal?
Yes.
You may or may not know, Katherine, that I've written a resolution for the national body of the UCC to endorse the Green New Deal. That resolution has already been passed by the Vermont and the Pacific Northwest conferences, and it will go to our national body in June. And you could have written it yourself. All it is an endorsement of those principles, and it articulates those principles. And I'm just wondering if you have anything to say about that.
Yes, thank you for asking. So as a scientist, I am very clear that the planet itself, the climate system, doesn't care how we cut carbon. It just cares that we do it. So scientifically, we can't say this is the best way to do it because the planet just wants us to do it as soon as possible. But ethically and morally, as a human with a heart, that's where we can make the decision of what we think is the best way. And so I am a big fan of the Green New Deal for 2 reasons. First of all, I am Canadian, so I don't comment explicitly on US policy. I say, hey, as long as it cuts carbon and people can get on board with it, I'm all for it. But what I've seen are 2 things. First of all, the Green New Deal has actually got a ton of people talking. I saw some analysis on social media. It has gotten way more people talking about climate change. And as you know, if you watch my TED Talk, I'll put a link to my TED Talk in here. The most important thing we can do about climate change is talk about it, because if people don't talk about it, why would we care? And I showed you, people don't care. And if we don't care, why do we want to fix it? So it got people talking. And so I am like, yes, that is fantastic. And then the second thing I like about it is when people say to me, I don't support the Green Deal, what I say is, well, that's your prerogative, because politics is certainly a matter of opinion. So please tell me, what's your plan to cut carbon? And then we can get into a lot of great discussions about, well, did you know that, as Polly just said, there is an Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act currently being, before Congress that was proposed by Republican and Democrat congressmen. That's pretty interesting. So we can have conversations about different solutions, because the bottom line is we need a solution. We can agree that we need a solution, then we can argue briefly over what that solution looks like, then we have to act. Jim, can you just do like all the hand gestures to accompany all my talks from now on?
I'd be glad to.
I love it. Catherine, you had Deborah Mabood asked, could you clarify the rich getting richer, clarify the cause of the rich getting richer as a result of climate change?
Yes, and in fact, what I'm going to do is, this is why I love having my computer, I'm actually going to show you an article on my screen so you can see it, okay? So let's see. Here is the study I was referring to. Can you guys see that okay? Yes, okay. It says that the economic gap between the richest and poorest nations is, and this is crazy, about 25% larger.
Wow.
And most of that is because warming temperatures have significantly slowed economic growth in the tropical countries, and they have actually aided economic growth in cooler countries like Scandinavia, Canada, and the United Kingdom.
Wow. Wow.
25%.
Wow.
All right, Catherine, I'm going to kind of roll together some of the questions here, because they all revolve around how do we best make a difference? How do we influence our legislators? How do we activate our congregation who isn't generally concerned right now? What can we do on a personal level? People are anxious to figure out how they can best utilize their own agency.
Excellent.
And if it's okay with you, Catherine, I'd also like Jim to weigh in on that as well.
Yes, I would love that too. Okay, so what I would say is, that is exactly the topic of my TED Talk, which was just released a couple of months ago. So if you haven't seen this, please go ahead and give it a watch. It's actually been translated to 15 languages, which is amazing.
Wow.
And in this, I talk specifically about how do we have these conversations. I will give you a summary in a nutshell, but I would ask you to please go watch this because it will explain in more detail. We have to begin those conversations with something that the person or people we're talking to already genuinely care about. Not something we just care about and we're bringing to them, but something they care about. And if we do not know what that is, we need to get to know them first. Because mutual respect, compassion, care, really viewing somebody as a genuine human who's worth just as much as we are, if not more. Thank you. That's what is needed.
I'm shouting.
Yes, this is my favorite webinar ever. I love this. Yes, I'm preaching it.
Yes, definitely.
And so
definitely.
Even in churches, that doesn't mean that you can just go in with the same message in every church, because every church has different priorities. And so getting to know whether you're talking to a politician or whether you're talking to a local decision maker, whether you're talking to your neighbor or family or a church, you need to get to know them and figure out what makes them tick. And so whenever I speak anywhere, I always make sure I have conversations with somebody ahead of time to figure out, well, what do you really care about? What does your organization care about? Why did you invite me? How does this connect to your mission, your goal, your focus, your values, your concerns? And that's where we can have the constructive conversations. And I want to give you one example before I move on to Jim, because I want to hear what Jim has to say. A couple of years ago, my approach was tested. It was tested very severely. I was asked to come speak to the leadership team of a very large oil and gas company here in Texas. And I said to myself, well, I cannot accept this invitation unless I feel that I can begin my conversation with them on something that we genuinely agree on and share. So I thought about this for a while, and I realized this, and we have a global weirding episode actually that I made after about this. I realized I am truly grateful for fossil fuels. Because when you look at what our lives were like 300 years ago, the endless drudgery that was a woman's life, when you look at the fact that we had an entire economy, especially in the US, based off slave labor. And the fact that the industrialization of the North with fossil fuels helped to end that. How can I not be profoundly grateful for that? Imagine what my life would be like. Imagine your life without a washing machine, a refrigerator, light bulbs, transportation, medical advances that came with the Industrial Revolution. So, and energy isn't easy. Coal mining is a terrible job. Working the oil rigs in West Texas is brutal. And so I came to that company with the approach of, you guys are amazing. Look at what you have brought us. We have come so far thanks to your contributions. And then now let's talk about the future, because you know energy, you've given us energy, you know how important energy is. You know how if we look at the poorest countries in the world, they don't have energy. And that's a big part of why they're in such suffering today. How can we ensure people get their energy for the future? So that's where it went, and it went fantastic. In fact, I've done quite a few things with them since then. So that was really, I think, the true litmus test for that method, and I can tell you it works.
Beautiful.
I'll just, before I add something, I want to point out to the audience something that is obvious to the 250 people on this call. Katherine started preaching when she offered her response to that. And I want to use that as a segue to what I have to say, which is when I distill from the half-hour presentation Katherine has just made to us, all of the facts and all of the consequences, I just cannot believe that pastors aren't preaching on this topic all the time, because pastors don't have to do that first step. Pastors already know the values of their congregation. Pastors are already trusted messengers. And I think our job, to answer your question more directly, Brooks, is to continue to get more and more pastors to be willing to do what they consider to be a risk in terms of talking about climate change. Some sort of edgy thing for us to wonder about, Katherine. Your husband's a pastor, and it would be interesting to get his input on this as well as yours, and that is, well, in terms of figuring out what people's values are, if you're elevated in the pulpit and you're giving a message, then there's kind of a disconnect with the first, the foundational point, and we have to work that out. We have to figure that out. And so that was the only qualification I wanted to offer. But as everybody on this call knows, I've been working like crazy to try to get more and more pastors to commit to this. And what we're finding is more and more are. Related to that is just one last thing, and that is in relation to those statistics that Katherine showed us. Those are 2018 statistics. And I know Katherine knows this. In the past 4 months of 2019, there has been a bigger shift than in any previous 4-month period. The people are more concerned by 5 percentage points than they have ever been. People are realizing that it's happening in the United States by a 9 percentage point gap over the past 4 months. So we need to realize that there is momentum to be seized upon here. So that's it for me for now, Brooks. Go ahead.
Great.
I'm going to highlight. If you don't mind. Yep. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Let me so I was trying to look here too. So let me tag on to that with a comment by David. He said, climate change is still seen as too political to discuss in churches. I would say that is a myth that many people believe, for sure. But I want to add one more example similar to the one I just gave, but for a church. I was invited, this is just a few weeks ago, I was invited to speak at a very conservative institution, like very. About as, if you went to, after Liberty University, I was number 2 or 3. And I don't mean theologically, I mean politically conservative, but it's a Christian organization. The person who invited me received a number of emails from leadership there before my arrival. He shared a few of those emails with me. They said things like, why are we inviting someone like her here to talk about global warming when we know she's going to tell us the only solution is abortion? You are spreading Satan's lies by having this woman come to speak. That is just one example of the many emails he got. So, David, what I did, first of all, I was grateful that, oh, believe me, I have a folder that when I write a book when I'm 80, it is going to be interesting reading. So what I did was I showed up and I took a page out of Mitch Hescott's book. He, of course, is from the Evangelical Environmental Network. And I said, all right, I'm here to talk about the sanctity of life. I'm here to talk about pro-life values. I'm here to talk about how we care about people from conception to death. And here's how the unborn and babies and children and adults and elderly people are being affected by the extraction of fossil fuels, the combustion of fossil fuels, and the resulting climate change from fossil fuels. And I'll post a link here because it is a recording, and it went well. And one of the people who sent one of those emails actually went up to the guy who invited me afterwards. He said, that was pretty good. I take that as the highest praise.
Beautiful.
Great.
Beautiful.
Thank you for that. Well, I'm going to shift gears a little bit. I was looking at a question stood out to me here, and it connects with one of your recent articles that you're quoted in. This year, recently, we quoted an article entitled "Children Influence Their Parents' Opinions on Climate Change." And the question is, we are forming a kids group at our church dedicated to taking action on climate change.
Nice.
Do you have suggestions for engaging children on the issue? How can they become change agents? Yeah. So I'll let you take that question.
I love that. So there was a new study that showed that when children are educated, they're able to change their parents' minds. And it was done in North Carolina, which is a pretty conservative part of the country. And they've actually made their curriculum available online. It's linked to the study. And what they found, which I love, was that daughters were most effective at changing their conservative father's minds. I was like, oh, not that I have to change my father's mind. You know, he's a science teacher and I learned at his knee, but so many of us, anecdotally, so many of my colleagues have parents, family, mothers, fathers who reject the science they do. And my colleagues go to them and say, I'm a grown woman or man and I study this full time. Mom, do you think I'm an idiot? Or do you think I'm lying to you? But Rush Limbaugh says. They're just like, so this was a really encouraging result. And I think that it's important to give children accurate information and critical thinking skills. So not force feeding them with our own perspective or view, not giving them a lot of doom-filled messages, but giving them hopeful messages and helping them understand and filter all of the constant information that we're bombarded with through the media and social media today. Even young children get this and pick this up from their peers and colleagues and friends at school, friends, and teachers. So one of our most popular and funnest, in my opinion, one of our funnest global weirding episodes is the one that we did, weirding kids, let me just find it for you. The one that we did on kids. And when I first started to write it, I thought, well, you know, what are we going to get to say here? But then it turns out that there were so many amazing stories we couldn't even, contain ourselves. Kids are doing incredible things. And when we talk to our kids, it's important to explain what's happening to them, but it's also important to empower them to act. And that's where my favorite verse in the Bible comes in, which is from 2 Timothy, where Paul tells Timothy that God has not given us a spirit of fear. So if we react out of fear to situations in the world or our lives, that is not coming from God. God has given us a spirit of love, to have compassion and care for others, spirit of power or empowerment so we can act instead of being frozen, and a sound mind to make good decisions. And this, I think, really embodies what I would like to teach and communicate to my child.
Great. Thank you.
I just wanted to add on a practical note, I don't know if it's in that article, I don't think it is, that there's a movement that has started probably because of that article, encouraging kids to ask their grandparents to vote the way the kid would want them to. So, and this is an intergenerational dialogue churches all over the nation could broker.
Great. And I'm going to share a link to that article as well on children influencing their parents, because as you lift up, it's the daughters who are really the great change agents. And I'm proud of that because I've got two daughters myself. So we need to empower our daughters to be change agents on climate change. To shift gears once again, to kind of get the full spectrum of your thoughts on things, there's a question here about, do we need to be talking about system change here, talking about the sort of a capitalist economy, the idea that's common in some circles that to address climate change, we really have to think about system change. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, but. So often people will say to me, if we can just get everybody to agree with science, we could fix the problem. Or they will say, if we could get rid of Citizens United, we could fix the problem. Or they say, if we could, you know, X, if we could get in a Democratic candidate, we could fix the problem. Never mind the fact that Hillary Clinton got the second most fossil fuel money after Ted Cruz heading into the next election. So we always say if, but unfortunately we run out of time. You know, if this were 40 years ago, sure, we might be able to do some of those things, but we don't now. So we have to act as swiftly as we can within the given system, while at the same time recognizing the system is broken and it has to be fixed too.
All right, thank you, thanks. We're hitting on all the subjects here today. Let's see here, other questions. Michael, do you see any that we should highlight before we wrap things up here?
I'm answering a couple of them by typing as I can. Okay.
I'll say that there's a number of requests for links and reports. There's a request for slides. We'll do our best to kind of gather together the references and the links and put them together to an email to go out to everybody so that people can have access to those resources after this webinar.
I didn't realize I was on mute, but I don't have a question necessarily as much as I have a highlight that I wanted, somebody that I wanted to bring up, which is a Macaulay Alexander, who says that he or she is getting ready to walk from Canada to Key West to launch the first day for tomorrow on September the 22nd of 2019. Says they are launching it along with a number of organizations that assist persons with disabilities and disasters. The goal is to have a parallel day to Earth Day in the springtime, and this would be People Day, where people with and without disabilities can come together and walk, prepare for disasters, and ultimately climate change. So I wanted to make sure I brought that up. And the reason I wanted to bring that up is because I think that it is important that we operate together and no one is missed out. Katherine Hayhoe, as well as Jim in his book, have talked about community and community's involvement and really the bottom-up approach to organize it. If we want a movement build, it's going to take for us to come together collectively as a whole and build out a movement that will actually impact climate change and provide that knowledge base to those who don't really have that knowledge base. So in other words, it's about you getting to the table and having those discussions with your family and Uncle Jed them that you really don't want to have because you know he have crazy. But you still got to have that conversation anyway, because at this point, it's that important. I think, I would hope that in hearing what we've heard, we have actually heard the sense of urgency that we're really under. I hope you all heard that Katherine Hayhoe is a scientist, and she did say that they are talking in conservative terms when they gave you 12 years. So in all actuality, you really don't have 12 years. So tell Uncle Jay's crazy behind, hey, you need to get it together because this is important to all of us. And empower your kids to talk about this. I am grateful, so very grateful that my daughter has said that she's looking at actually studying environmental law. As much as I want her to do everything else in the world, I think that this is extremely important for this time because we need everybody talking about this. We need from 8 through 80, we need them talking about this, and even beyond and after, we need them talking about this. I have made it made a vow to myself and to God that I will not preach another sermon. I will not give another talk unless I mention climate change and environmental justice. It's that important to me. Anything outside of that for me is, I call it petty preaching. If I got to talk about who's sleeping with who, and I've got to talk about who's lying and who's doing this and the third, if it doesn't have any impact on the entire planet, if it doesn't have any impact on changing our culture and the way that we look at capitalism and our consumption, I'm not doing my job. I am not doing my job. I can talk about personal behavior, but if it isn't actually contributing to bettering this planet, I am not doing my job as a watcher on the wall. It's not enough just to see something. You've also got to say something. That is my call to action for everybody, and I thank you for joining us. And I hope that you will take these words and actually see something and say something.
Thank you, Michael, for that closing call to action. It's our tradition for this to get Michael to fire us up and on the launching pad and out the door to be change agents in the world. Big thanks to you, Katherine, for joining us. I'm delighted to hear that you think we do a good webinar. So thank you, and thank you, Jim, for being our surprise guest. It was a rich conversation to have all of you here today. We'll send out a YouTube recording of this as well and do our best to address the questions. So thank you to everybody again for joining. And Katherine, I'm aware that you also are rushing off to catch a plane, I think. And so thank you for squeezing us in your busy schedule and day.